Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book, and it is Little Blue Book number 1030. And it is titled The World's Great Religions, written by Joseph McCabe. And if you haven't noticed, I'm doing pretty much all Joseph McCabe right now. But anyways, this was copyright somewhere in the 1920s. Probably 26 to 30, somewhere in there. So he wrote a lot of these on different journeys he was taking, Joseph McCabe, across the Atlantic and to England, because he was English, and or I should say to the United States and around the world. He took ocean liners and a lot of time on ocean liners in the mid 1920s. So here we go. Here are the table of contents. This book has 8 chapters. And I'm not sure if I'll do a chapter per video or if I'll do 2 chapters. It depends how long they are. But anyway, here we go. Chapter 1, The Higher Evolution of Religion. Chapter 2, The Religions of Egypt and Babylon. Chapter 3, The Chinese Religions and Confucius. Chapter 4, Buddha and the Religions of India. Chapter 5, The Ancient American Religions. Chapter 6, Religion in Persia and Palestine. Chapter 7, The Religions of Greece and Rome. And Chapter 8, The Rise of Christianity. And we'll start off with, of course, Chapter 1. Okay, here we go. Little Blue Book number 1030, The World's Greatest Religions. Chapter 1, The Higher Evolution of Religion. In Little Blue Book number 1008, entitled The Origin of Religion, which is the book I just did before this one, I trace the origin and early development of religious ideas. So you should probably go listen to that one if you haven't already. Let me introduce this study of the later development with a short sketch of how, in the course of tens of thousands of years, men rose from a level of life without religion to the rich rituals and mythologies which we find at the dawn of civilization. In this book, we trace the story further, up to the appearance of Christianity. There came a time toward the close of the long infancy of the race when man began, as a boy will, to look into the machinery of things, to speculate on their causes. His shadow caught his attention, and he concluded that it must be a living double or duplicate of himself. He thought that it was this shadow which wandered abroad, and he had strange experiences while he slept. He imagined nature, especially during the night, when at least no one could deny their presence, as full of the shadowy parts of or souls of his dead fellows. They seemed to be soured and malicious, and he began to fear and this is going to be a difficult word for my brain apparently. Propitiate. Propitiate. He started to do that for them. It was the dawn of religion. From his primitive communist level, man arose, or fell, if you like, to a state of society in which strong men or chiefs ruled over the majority. They were very powerful, and their turning the page, and their shades remained powerful in the spirit world. They were little gods, and as the ages rolled on, and the earthly chiefs became princes and had to be flattered and appeased, the soul princes in the spirit land had also to be flattered and appeased. It was the dawn of worship. Where was the spirit land? At first, men said it was in the woods or in the dark, anywhere out of sight. When it became fairly clear that the shades were not there, they said that they were underground or on the mountains or up in the sky with the sun and moon and stars. It was the dawn of the legend of heaven and hell. As life became more complete, It grew more and more important to earn the favor of the demigods in the correct and effective way. Sometimes it was done successfully, very often not. And the poor man's health, crops, cattle, or success in hunting depended upon the correctness of his worship. So a caste of experts arose, and like other experts, they lived on their services. It was the dawn of priesthood. But since the issue did not really depend upon spirits which did not exist, the priests were no more successful than the ordinary man. They had to persuade him that they were, or their lauders would be empty. They had to deceive, to invent reasons why the sacrifice did not bring its reward, to suggest that a man's sins stood in the way. It was the dawn of priestcraft. Meantime, man's mind had continued to grow and to speculate on the movements of things. What was it that raged in the storm or the fire? What was it that swept the river along, sent down the rain, or soared in the thunder? Why was the eagle, the shark, or the crocodile so powerful and so malicious? Why did the corn and the trees rise again every year? Spirits, of course. It was the dawn of fetishism, or the worship of spirit-controlled sticks and stones, and of taboo, the stern prohibition to slay, eat, or even touch certain things. The greater movements in nature must be the work of greater spirits. The broiling sun, so aloof from everything else, must be the home of a very powerful spirit. The broad blue sky, which rained the beneficent rain or spat fire and bellowed in the thunder, must have an equally powerful spirit. The moon, the wind, the earth, all the great elements, must have mighty gods to work them. It was the dawn of polytheism. Kings grew more powerful by war and annexation. One ruler swallowed up smaller princes and did the work of 10. One god might take the place of 10. The bigger you made your god, the more godlike he was. But rival priests would not sacrifice their gods, and they stirred rival bodies of the faithful to rebel and fight for them. Here and there, however, a priesthood got the ear of a prince, and its rivals were suppressed by royal decree or frozen into silence. It was the dawn of monotheism. But man's mind grew larger and larger. Cities were built, and cities are never so hospitable to gods. Books were written and questions asked. A good deal of what had been ascribed to the gods was traced to gases, vapors, or even priests. Might not the whole of nature be thus explained? It was, more than 2,000 years ago, the dawn of atheism. The evidence for this view of the origin and development of religion was given in The Origin of Religion, Little Blue Book number 1008, one I did just before this. It follows the facts more closely than any other theory does. It sums up tens of thousands of years of one of the most curious and most fascinating excursions of the human mind in the days of its profound prehistoric ignorance. And it brings us to the threshold of the higher religions development, which we now have to study. We shall still find the progress of the mind of the race very slow, very gradual, and very natural. There is no leap onward. No new commandments are thrust upon the race amidst thunder and lightning. No sacred truth is traced with finger of fire on the firmament or in the mind of a prophet. There is no revelation, no impulse from outside the universe. No modern historian of religion describes any phase of the long development where such rapid progress is made that we may even suspect the interference of a superhuman power. A few of the writers on comparative religion are discreet or timid when they reach the origin of Christianity in the first century of its triumph, or its triumph in the fourth. Stop, I got an itchy elbow. What's that all about? I just took a shower. All right. Okay, let's go. Okay, into fourth. We may see in other books how little ground there is for the diplomatic vagueness. The stream runs on unbroken through the ages, a stream of human thought dammed and diverted by priesthoods for ages, always in the end sweeping away the dams in reformations and pouring on. In particular, we find that contrary to a belief which is almost universal outside scholarly circles, the rise of monotheism, the substitution of one god for many gods, was entirely natural. It occurred more than once, long before the first of the Hebrew prophets was born. We shall see that what are called the ethical religions evolved just as naturally as nature religions. Morality, as I show in The Human Origin of Morals, Little Blue Book number 1061, arose independently of religion. The crude early nature spirits and even the early gods were not interested in a man's social conduct. That concerned society. The priest said that all the gods asked was sacrifice and ceremony and the proper support of the priests, of course. But as priesthoods grew more powerful, and since the priests were the more leisured and better educated, they took over the control of more of the daily life of man. Social conduct was important from their point of view, so social law became a semi sacred moral law, then a religious law dictated by the gods. All this will be apparent when we examine the early stages of the historic religions. The sacred books of these religions give a false account of their early history, but modern scholars have fairly unraveled that tangled skeins of fact and fiction. On much the same lines in different parts of the earth, but with differences due to surroundings, climate, and economic conditions, the various sections of the human family have moved slowly on through polytheism and monotheism toward atheism. I explain in The Origin of Religion how we know these things, and books on the Old and New Testament show how and why the sacred writings of various civilizations have to be very carefully checked. The crude beginning of the nation, the humble and semi barbaric days, have to be hidden or misrepresented. The God who was ultimately adopted by the nation as the one true God has to be described from the start as the all powerful patron of that particular people, which was, of course, his chosen people. The priests who write the sacred books have to show that their order and their ceremonies were instituted at the very beginning of the civilization. The action of their gods must be seen throughout. Is that not human nature? It is, at all events, authentic history. And we'll pause there for hydration. Guys, I'm thirsty. Cottonmouth. That is a cup I got in Garrard, Kansas, at the little Garrard Museum, where Little Blue books were published. And that is a Little Blue Book festival cup, apparently, they had there that I missed, and I'm hoping they have another one. All right, here we go. We have therefore to examine with great care the supposed historical parts of the Hebrew, the Persian, the Hindu, or the Chinese sacred writings. But there is, and has been for decades, a precise science of these matters, and the archaeologist who uncovers the material remains of the old civilizations has given us many very positive means of checking the written statements. We now study religions as impartially as we study stars or economic systems. It goes without saying that the later and higher education of or evolution of religion is much more interesting than the earlier. Religion was, in its origin, merely some sort of naive speculation about the universe on the part of a profoundly ignorant race. But the higher religions claim that they were inspired or revealed by the gods. Each despises and ridicules the claim of the others, it is true. In Europe and America, there are still millions who are quite astonished that other religions should make such a claim, or should dare to question the claim of the Hebrew and Christian religions. We shall see that as in every other section of religious thought, this attitude is simply due to the confining of exact knowledge to learned men. We have now a science of religion and of comparative religion. It follows the methods of the other sciences as it is, like them, entirely evolutionary. Just as stars exist in every phase of evolution and give us an unshakable basis for the doctrine of the evolution of worlds, so religions in every stage of development exist, and their degree of development is precisely in accordance with the general mental level of the races which hold them. Moreover, we have here the additional assistance of historical records and archaeological remains. There are few fields in which evolution is clearer than it is in its application to religion. The picture which this science presents us is profoundly different from the common belief about religion. It excludes every claim for a special origin of one or another creed. Some religions are, of course, superior to others. We naturally expect the later to improve in many respects upon the earlier, and the latest ought to be the best of all. But these advances are quite gradual and imperfect. There is not the least ground for thinking that any one of the great religions is a unique institution of supernatural origin. We simply see the various religions borrowing from each other, superseding each other, and slowly improving as the mind of the race improves. Whenever a sudden or very rapid advance is claimed, we shall find in our later historical studies that the advance was made slower than is commonly represented, and that the religion or religions which superseded were misrepresented and libeled by the new religion in order to give itself a fictitious superiority. And the picture we have to contemplate is in another very simple or very important way different from that in the mind of believers. Even the experts who, as I said, feel that they are on delicate ground and are diplomatic, fail to bring out clearly one interesting fact. None of them admits revelation, but sometimes they represent the story as a mighty struggle through the ages of the religious instinct of man. We saw that he has no such thing to express itself. Others talk learnedly of a struggle for life and creeds and institutions and a natural selection of the fittest to survive. This is true to some extent, but in the main, we have not an evolutionary struggle of ideas, but a struggle for life of priesthoods. In their own corporate interests, they fight each other, and their success or failure is very largely connected with political or general historical conditions. In other little blue books, we see this most plainly where it is least expected. In the case of Christianity, that's the end of chapter 1. And since that was a small chapter, we'll go on to chapter 2. But first, some hydration. Okay, chapter 2. Oh, pardon me. The religions of Egypt and Babylon. By the world's greatest religions, I mean the religions of what we call the civilized peoples of the earth. Our social order is so glaringly imperfect that the question may arise in a later generation whether we men of the 20th century were really civilized. In science, however, the word civilization merely indicates a certain intellectual level, not a moral standard. When, in the course of its evolution, a branch of the human race acquires written language and a certain degree of art and poetry, we call it civilized. It has passed the barbaric stage. We have to see how religion at this point improves, just as the weapons and dress and pottery do. It may be useful to the reader if I borrow from a small work of mine The Evolution of Civilization, a little sketch of the rise of civilization. It occurred about 5 or 6 thousand years ago. The earliest dates in history are naturally uncertain, but there is a general agreement that between 5 and 6 thousand years ago, man came to the end of his millions of years of savagery and barbarism and opened the historical period. This took place in several independent centers, but these centers of the first appearance of civilization, Crete, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, the Asiatic and American civilizations came much later, are not far from each other, and the reason why they became the cradles of civilization is now well known. The islands of Crete is in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. The valley of the Nile is just to the south of it, and the Mesopotamian plain is a little east of it. Now we know from positive geological evidence that this eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea was dry land during the coldest part of the Great Ice Age, say about 30 to 40,000 years ago. And it is clear that the refugees from frozen Europe would gather thickly there and multiply. This congestion or contact of people is the first condition of progress of new ideas. As the population of the area grew, some would push south and discover the fertile valley of the Nile, while other pioneers would press east and find the equally fertile plains of Mesopotamia. And this dispersion was quickened by a great catastrophe. When the billions of tons of ice and snow melted from the face of Europe, the level of the Atlantic Ocean was raised, and the waters poured through the breach, which we now call the Straits of Gibraltar. The eastern basis of the Mediterranean was flooded, and doubtless a good deal of its semi-civilization perished in the waves. There was probably have the origin. That sentence doesn't make sense. Uh, Probably have the origin of the legend of the deluge, which was widespread in the region, and the legend of the lost Atlantis. However that may be, the three great groups in Crete, Egypt, and Mesopotamia now independently evolved civilization about 3000 or 4000 BC for reasons which I have given elsewhere. The mind of man had developed with comparative rapidity during the later part of the Ice Age and during the new Stone Age, which followed it. Pottery became finer, and a crude picture writing began. This we call the beginning of civilization. In spite of the conservative, okay, in spite of the conservatism, that word just doesn't, my brain just stopped. In spite of the conservatism, that's why, of priests whose claim that a revelation had been given to them makes them reluctant to acknowledge any error or admit any improvement. Religion is always carried a stage onward when the race advances. Men began to perceive its crudities. Priests, in the end, readjust themselves by refining it. Yeah. And for a time, it has another spell of power. But a higher stage of civilization always brings fresh skepticism. If civilization had developed continuously since the laying of its foundations in Crete and Egypt, the era of religion would have been over long ago. Wars, however, and the constant collapse of a civilization to which wars led, retarded the growth of the spirit of man, so that we are only now entering upon the last phase. In the case of Crete, a civilization quite as high and as old as that of Egypt, though we discovered it only 20 years ago, the evolution of religion is unique. We have not yet deciphered the Cretan language, but we have sufficient remains to guide us. I visited the ruins a few years ago and marveled at the skill and art of this lost world, but I must confine myself here to what we know about its religion. Briefly, while the Knossos Palace itself have housed several hundred courtiers, and servants, the royal chapel would accommodate only 2 people on a kind of altar ledge. In it is a painted statuette about 18 inches high of the Cretan goddess. Until a very late date in its history, Crete seems to have had no male god, and the exaggerated breasts of the lady goddess indicate that the object of worship was Mother Earth. Even in the towns which we have on Earth, there is no trace of temples. There are merely small open enclosures which may have contained a sacred tree or tree of life, another proof that they clung to the old worship of fertility. Thus we see that the Cretans had not passed the stage of nature worship, and the cult was of the simplest description. Of all the ancient civilizations, it was clearly the least religious, and every feature of it seems to show that it was also the gayest and happiest. We know nothing about its morals. A few seals of the kind which we call indecent have been found, but such things occur in all civilizations. The Egyptians seem to have been the southern branch of the same race, yet there is the greatest conceivable contrast in religious development. From the start, they had a crowd of gods and priests and priesthoods, and they developed the belief in a future life with an intensity that has a parallel only in Christianity. At death, they believed a man's double, of which they had only a vague conception, remained in the tomb with the mummy, but the soul went before the god Osiris to be judged. If its evil deeds outweighed the good, it was annihilated. There was no barbaric doctrine of eternal torment. If the good deeds prevailed, the soul went into a state of bliss for all eternity. And as the code of judgment was a high moral standard, the general character was as good as in modern times. All this, however, we tell at length in Religion and Morals in Ancient Egypt, Little Blue Book number 1077. For the details are of the greatest interest and importance. Here, a slight outline of the development will be enough. What chiefly surprises the man who wanders through the Egyptian gallery of a museum or opens an illustrated book on Egypt is the greatest number of divinities, especially animal-headed divinities. How could so great a nation retain such monstrous deities? But we must remember that in historic Egypt, it was only the ignorant majority who took these old deities seriously. Just as in the modern Christian world, the deity of the cultivated is not the deity of the people. We must remember, too, that each of these old cow-headed goddesses or jackal-headed gods had a powerful priesthood. It was the priest who fought for the gods. In the beginning, it is quite intelligible, if we bear in mind that material and political conditions have as much influence on religion as on anything else. Egypt is a unique country. It is a very long and very narrow valley. The result of this was that each section of the valley had its own tribe, and it took ages for one kingdom to spread over the whole. These tribes had come into Egypt from different quarters, and each had its own god or gods. And we're going to pause there for hydration. Hydrate, Maddie. We saw that religion began with a belief in spirits everywhere in nature, but especially in curious or powerful objects in nature. So different tribes saw divinity in the sun, the moon, the hawk, the cow, the bull, the crocodile, the ape, the ram, and so on. When they settled down, wars with their neighbors occurred, and the greatest bitterness arose from the rivalry of their gods. The cult of each was hardened and grew powerful. But even before the historic period, there were great nature gods which were represented only in human form. Osiris, probably the sun god originally, Ra, another sun god, Isis, possibly at first a fertility goddess, Horus, later a savior god, Niet, Niet, N-E-I-T, Niet, probably pronouncing that incorrectly, probably the fertility goddess of another tribe, and so on. When Egypt was organized, the priests arranged these deities as man and wife, mother and son, and so on, and thus more or less organized religion. But the priest constantly intrigued, and at times one or another deity became the supreme god. In 1400 years before Christ, King Amenhotep the the fourth instituted a pure spiritual monotheism as the one religion of Egypt. But we have a special volume on Egyptian religion and morals with full details. Here we need only indicate their place in the general evolution of religion. In the case of Babylon also, where our discoveries about the morals and religion of the people have been very remarkable, we shall require a special volume of this series to give even a summary of the facts. A few words about the religious development will suffice here to make this general sketch complete. The kingdom of Babylon was founded about 4,000 years ago, and it had been preceded by 1,000 years of city-states very largely ruled by priests in different parts of the Mesopotamian plain. How all of these came about we shall have more space to tell later, and I will merely say here that two different races, the Sumerians, possibly akin to the early Chinese, and the Semites, a race like the Hebrews, mingled in the cities and more or less adjusted their gods to each other. There were no animal gods, such as the material conditions had developed in Egypt. The spirits in the minor departments of nature, common to all religions at first, remained more spirits, and as priesthoods of the greater gods developed, they turned these into devils. The Babylonian believed as firmly as the less educated modern Christian does that the world is full of legions of devils. But long before the historic period began, the gods and the greater elements of nature were the only objects of worship. As I said, two entirely different peoples cooperated in making the civilization of Babylonia, and this meant a double series of nature gods. The Sumerians had Snu, sky god, Ea, earth god, Sin, moon god, Nusku, fire god, and so on. Then there were Shamash, another sun god, Marduk, a third sun god, Ishtar, of love and war, Tammuz, ancient fertility god, and others. The story of Babylonian religion, after all the city-states were welded together in the kingdom of Babylon, is a story of rivalries and ambitions of priesthoods, resulting in the temporary supremacy of one or other god. When the city of Babylon rose to supremacy, its particular god, Marduk, also rose to supremacy. Later, Shamash became the one true God. There were several spells of monotheism. With the advance of civilization, moreover, the religion was refined and the gods were made more spiritual and ethical. We see in Morals in Ancient Babylon, Little Blue Book number 1076, that we have found prayer books, or the ancient equivalent, which use language that could be used in churches today. Shamash became a monotheistic god of the most spiritual type. Ishtar, whose worship was no doubt in very ancient times connected with sacred prostitution, actually became the refuge of sinners and the guardian of virtue. Plenty of extracts from Babylon and Egyptian literature are given in the two special volumes to illustrate these slender observations. For the other greater religions of the world, it is not necessary to have special books, except Judaism and a series for Christianity, and we must consider them and their position in the general evolution more closely. And that is the end of chapter 2, and that is where we will stop for today. Thanks for listening. This is part 1 of Little Blue Book number 1030, titled The Great Religions. The World's Great Religions, written by Joseph McCabe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.